Well, thank you very much for having me here. The talk today on replacing knowledge is part of a larger project that I like to call conceptual engineering. That is, thinking about ways of improving our conceptual scheme, in particular, improving the aspects of our conceptual scheme that philosophers tend to focus on, and developing the idea that most, maybe all, of the concepts that philosophers typically think about and try to analyze are actually defective and need, in many cases, to be replaced for various purposes. And that's the attitude I'm going to take toward our concept of knowledge in today's presentation. So there's three kind of main areas that you might look at if you think that the concept of knowledge is defective or inconsistent. Three kinds of paradoxes associated with knowledge. The first one is Fitch-style paradoxes, and they're listed on the handout. Fitch-style paradoxes where we can show using very innocent principles associated with knowledge that if everything is knowable, then everything is in fact known. That has traditionally been thought of in the discussion with the global anti-realist, but my claim is that this is actually a paradox associated with knowledge, because you shouldn't be able to derive something like that from the constitutive principles for our concept of knowledge. The second category is knower-type paradoxes, which were developed by Kaplan and Montague, thinking about what was called the surprise examination paradox, which is from the well, at least received a decent amount of attention in the philosophical literature in the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s. The Kaplan-Montague work is from the early 1960s, and there the paradox is something like the sentence listed on there: no one knows this very sentence. And from basic principles of knowledge, you can derive that it's both known and not known, derive a contradiction. The derivation is very similar to the derivation in the liar paradox. That's probably not surprising because of the structure of the sentences involved are very similar as well. Okay, now the third category of paradoxes that you might associate with the concept of knowledge are skeptical paradoxes. And in Duncan Pritchard's recent book, Epistemic Angst, he takes great pains to formulate these as paradoxes and not as somewhat unpleasant encounters with a skeptic, right? Instead of thinking of them as, what do you do when you encounter another person that talks to you like a skeptic talks to you? It's instead formulated as potentially inconsistent groups of principles or propositions that seem super plausible for being true of our concept of knowledge. It's the third one that I'm going to focus on today. I think that any decent approach to replacing the concept of knowledge has to address all three. I'm not going to address all three. I'm just going to do the third one today because I think it's the most interesting. But the approach today would have to be integrated with a different approach to knower-type paradoxes and a different approach to Fitch-type paradoxes in order to really replace the concept of knowledge for all the sorts of situations that, all the sorts of situations in which it causes trouble. All right, so I could go with a whole bunch of different theorists on the skeptical paradox, but instead I'm going to go after some low-hanging fruit because Matt Wiener has already argued that our concept of knowledge is inconsistent or defective, and that it has constitutive principles that are themselves, inconsistent, or at least inconsistent given certain, obvious facts about the world. So I'm just going to piggyback on Wiener's approach here and suggest a better way of thinking about the inconsistency of knowledge, and then advocate a particular replacement strategy, whereas Wiener does not advocate replacement. He thinks that our concept of knowledge is inconsistent, it is defective, but the defect is mostly harmless. I would expect it would have to be all harmless in order to not want to replace it, but either way, that's the line that you get from Wiener. Instead, I'm going to say it needs to be replaced. It's not just a harmless defect. Okay, so Wiener looks at three principles associated with knowledge, and they are the disquotation principle, the practical environment principle, and the parody of evidence principle. Disquotation says an utterance of S knows that P is, at time T, is true if and only if at T, S knows timelessly or tenselessly, whatever that is, that P. The practical environment principle, S's evidence for P is good enough for knowledge, if and only if S's evidence for P is good enough to make it epistemically rational for her to act on the assumption that P. And then finally, the parity of evidence principle, if the evidence concerning P for two people, S and T, is the same, then S's evidence is good enough for knowledge, if and only if T's is good enough for knowledge. That is, you can't have two people with exactly the same evidence, but where one knows and the other one doesn't. Either they both know or neither of them do. All right, Wiener argues that these are constitutive of the concept of knowledge in the sense of being meaning constitutive. Now, there's a long tradition of thinking about meaning constitutivity, and Wiener fits squarely within this tradition by advocating a pretty popular view of meaning constitutivity, which is that it's associated with concept possession. Wiener's idea is that anybody who possesses the concept of knowledge is going to at least be disposed to believe these three principles. Maybe you can fight hard and overcome those dispositions, but you're at least going to be disposed initially to believe or accept or endorse these three principles on the basis of your possession of this concept. We could run the whole thing in terms of competence with the word instead of possession with the concept. None of that makes any difference. All right. So he writes, the knowledge principles are inconsistent, given only the truism that different people can have different practical stakes. Take a bank case from DeRose, in which Hannah and Leela each have the same rather good evidence that the bank is open Saturday, but acting on a mistaken belief would harm Hannah much more than Leela. Hannah is in the high-stakes context, Leela is in a low-stakes context. The practical environment principle, which entails that Leela knows that the bank is open and Hannah does not, given Leela's belief, confers no non-epistemic benefits. Here guarantees an inconsistency with the parity of evidence principle, which entails that Leela knows if and only if Hannah does. So now, I don't know if you noticed, but in that little bit of reasoning to the contradiction, he only appealed to two principles, right? The disquotation principle does zero work. So for some reason, that doesn't come out in the paper. But for our purposes, that's going to be important. So we're going to really treat this as a paradox associated only with the latter two principles, and we're going to ignore the disquotation principle from here on because it doesn't do anything. Now, he goes on to make a couple of points. One, semantic competence with knowledge locutions requires a disposition to accept those three principles. That's what I said already. That's what makes them constitutive. Now, we're going to come back to this issue in just a minute because he takes a little bit of heat from Gillian Russell about this aspect of his view, and I'm going to say that, yeah, she's right, that that's a problem for him, but he can adopt a better view of constitutivity which will overcome that problem. It turns out that the better view of constitutivity is my view, but don't let that make you think that it's not right. All right. Now, Anil Gupta, in a really nice paper called Meaning and Misconceptions from 1999, a paper that nobody reads ever, laid out a theory of inconsistent concepts. And his example has to do with a certain group of people who use a locution up above. And Wiener borrows almost entirely Gupta's theory of inconsistent concepts to use as a model for how to understand the inconsistent concept of knowledge. Now, what I'm going to suggest in a moment is that Gupta's approach to inconsistent concepts is not the best one to employ here, and it ends up giving rise to a number of problems for Wiener's overall view. Let me just go through the example. Okay. So you got a community of people, I'm going to call them the Hyereans for obvious reasons, speak a language similar to English except that there's this expression X is up above Y. Now, X is up above Y is governed by two constitutive principles. One is a perceptual principle. I can just look at two things, and if they're in the right perceptually distinguishable relationship, then I can say this one's up above that one. But they both have to be visible for me to be able to make that kind of judgment. And so in situations where they're not visible, all the higher-ians have a really nice piece of technology. It allows them to determine the ray between any two objects and determine whether that ray is parallel to standard up. And if the ray is parallel to standard up, then it's legit to say that X is up above Y. And if it's not parallel to standard up, then it's not legitimate to say that X is up above Y. So now, given the fact that the higher-ians live on a spherical planet, any distance away from the standard up ray is going to, let me give you a little diagram here, H2, let's get away from it, right? Now the rays between two objects that are in the right perceptually distinguishable situation are not going to be parallel to standard up because they live on a sphere. This is an inconsistent concept. The constitutive principles for it are inconsistent. They are inconsistent with one another. In certain situations, when you're away from the standard up ray, the constitutive principles tell you for certain objects, A and B, that A is up above B, and it's not the case that A is up above B. All right. So in order to deal with this kind of situation and situations like it, Gupta advocates this technical notion of frames. Let me say a moment what a frame is. A frame is a way of privileging certain constitutive principles over others in certain situations so that you can deal with concepts like up above that are inconsistent or defective. So the perceptual frame is the one that privileges the perceptual criterion, and the conceptual frame is the one that privileges the parallel lines conceptual criterion. And then Gupta then distinguishes between the absolute and the effective features of the higher-ians discourse, and he says that the frames make sense of the effective semantic features for up above and any of the other locutions that are associated with it, I mean, synonymous with it in their language. All right. Wiener then borrows Gupta's model and says that the frame of a particular conversation is determined by the overlapping interests of those participating in that conversation. So the frame determines which of the knowledge principles are salient in that context. And if it's the parody principle that ends up being the most salient, then it trumps the other one. It overrides the practical one. If it's the practical one that ends up being especially salient in that situation, then it overrides the parody one. Okay, so that's the view. Now, Wiener contrasts his view, the view I've just laid out, with contextualism about knowledge, subject-sensitive invariantism about knowledge, and semantic relativism about knowledge. And he argues that his view is better than any of these three. When I say that, he advertises it as if he argues like it's better than any of those three, but he doesn't actually argue that. He only really argues that it's better than contextualism, because contextualism faces the dreaded semantic blindness objection, and his view does not. So the semantic blindness objection is that we are ignorant of certain semantic features of our words, like being context dependent, and that other things being equal, a semantic theory that does not attribute semantic blindness is to be preferred over one that does. There's a large body of literature on this semantic blindness worry for contextualist approaches, not just in epistemology, but in other areas as well. And I'm not going to debate the relative merits of the semantic blindness objection, just noting that that's what Wiener uses to motivate his inconsistency view over the contextualist view. He doesn't say anything about subject-sensitive invariantism. He doesn't say anything really about semantic relativism. By the way, subject-sensitive invariantism could be combined with a contextualism. So these aren't obviously incompatible, or you could have a subject-sensitive contextualism. The subject sensitivity and the invariantness need not be part of the same package. So you could think of other options here as well. By the way, for those of you who don't know about the semantic relativist says that, so I'll be a semantic relativist about knows, says that knows has the same content anytime it's used. Any context of utterance in which it's used, it has the same content, but its extension differs from context to context. Now, it might be context of utterance in which its extension differs, or it might be a different kind of context called a context of assessment in which its extension differs. So the context of utterance would be the context in which someone makes utters the sentence, Leela knows that the bank's open. Context of assessment would be someone hearing or being told that this was made and then assessing it for truth value or for semantic value. John McFarlane, probably the most famous semantic relativist about knowledge. Jason Stanley, John Hawthorne have argued for subject-sensitive invariantism. It's hard to know whether Hawthorne still endorses that, but and then contextualists are all over the place. We've already had a quote from, or a reference to DeRose on that. Okay, here's what I'm going to argue. Inconsistency views of knowledge are not competitors with contextualism or subject-sensitive invariantism or semantic relativism. In fact, on my view, the right way to think about an inconsistency view of the concept of knowledge is to pair it with a semantic relativism. So at the end of the day, at the end of the talk, what you're going to get is a different kind of justification for semantic relativism and a different kind of semantic relativism as well. The semantic relativism familiar from McFarlane is going to make certain predictions. The semantic relativism that you're going to get from me is going to make certain predictions, and those are going to be different. So the view is going to be different, and the argument for the view going to be different. Okay, so Wiener's argument, top of page 3 now. Inconsistency view doesn't require semantic blindness, but contextualism does. That's pretty much it. That's pretty much the only thing that he says in there to motivate his view over the competitors. Instead of defending Wiener with the Gillian Russell deal, I'm just going to skip that and say, if Gillian's right about that, then Wiener could just borrow my view of constitutive principles and avoid the objection. But I'm not going to go through that in detail. Instead, let's start attacking Wiener, and that's on the second half of page 3. All right. 1. He assumes that his own inconsistency principle is a competitor with the others, as I've said. Here's what he says. My account of inconsistency does fit well with inferentialist semantics and the idea that the inconsistent predicate does not correspond to anything in the world, but it may be possible to reconcile it with the truth-conditional semantics. Sorensen and Eklund give similar accounts of vagueness while maintaining that vague sentences have truth conditions. Sorensen argues that vague predicates have unknowable boundaries, but that at every point the competent user of the predicate must deny that there's a boundary, while Eklund argues that the semantic values for an inconsistent predicate should make its meaning constitutive principles as nearly correct as possible. Indeed, for all I know, indeed, for all I say, no may have some truth-conditional semantics that explains why competent speakers must be disposed to accept the inconsistent knowledge principles so that the principles would be derived from some more fundamental semantic competence instead of themselves constituting the meaning of no. Here, I'll merely diagnose the inconsistency without worrying about whether there can be an underlying truth-conditional semantics. Here's the problem, though. The truth-conditional approach to semantics should not be thought of as on par with an approach to the concept of knowledge. So saying that the concept of knowledge is inconsistent doesn't dictate any particular semantics for the term that expresses that concept. The considerations for thinking about knowledge as consistent or inconsistent are independent of the considerations for thinking about what kind of semantic theory is most appropriate for a word that expresses an inconsistent concept. Now, you can say something like, it turns out that usually the best semantic theory for a word that expresses an inconsistent concept is such and such, maybe semantic relativism. That's my view. But that's very different from saying that if you think that the concept is inconsistent, then that puts certain constraints on any proper semantics for the word that expresses it. Those are two different views. The latter is Wiener's view, and it's the one that I'm saying is wrong. The former is the view that I think is right. All right, so the distinction between a semantic theory on the one hand, a meta-semantic theory on the other, and a conceptual analysis is important here. A semantic theory just attributes semantic values or meanings to all the sentences of a particular fragment of natural language. Meta-semantics explains why those expressions have those meanings. And a conceptual analysis, we're all familiar with, but I'll say it anyway, a conceptual analysis provides some kind of definition of a concept in terms of other ones that are presumably more primitive or better understood or something like that. There's some kind of foundationalist assumption associated with doing conceptual analysis, at least in most cases. Wiener is conflating the conceptual analysis type project with giving us semantics. All right, number 2 on the back, page 4. Second problem. Now, Wiener's his only objection to any of what he takes to be competitors is an objection to contextualism. But it turns out that by interpreting frames as determined by the interests of the people in the conversation where the utterance takes place, he's effectively turning Gupta's frame view into a contextualist view. He's saying that depending on the context of utterance, the interests of the people involved are going to determine which of the constitutive principles wins out over the other one. And that's going to be the one that determines the semantic values of no's in that context of utterance. That is, by definition, a contextualist view. So Wiener's only objection to the views that he takes to be competitors actually ends up being an objection to his own view, at least as he's interpreting Gupta's theory of frames. All right, now, so much for the setup. Now let's think about the concept of knowledge in a bit more broad framework. Saying that our concept of knowledge is inconsistent is compatible with a wide range of different kinds of semantic theories that one might want to use for the word knows. For example, it might be that a contextualist semantics works okay for these sorts of locutions, or it might be that an invariantist semantics works well for them, or it might be that a semantic relativist treatment like McFarland's works well. I'm going to be advocating something like John McFarland's view, but it's, like I said, it's going to be a different kind of semantic relativism for the word knows based on the particular kind of inconsistent concept that that word expresses, or the particular way of thinking about inconsistent concepts that I think is right. All right, so because the concept of knowledge is inconsistent in this way, which I'm just taking for granted, like I said, I'm just piggybacking on Wiener's work there, but I'm happy to have conversation about justification for that in the Q&A. Because we're taking it to be inconsistent and we're taking it to be useful, it makes sense to replace the concept of knowledge with a new concept or multiple new concepts that will do the work that we want it to do in these problematic situations without giving rise to the contradictions that we seem to be able to derive from it. Now, this one way of breaking up an inconsistent concept and thinking about replacements for it is to say, let's just have one replacement for each of the central constitutive principles that's causing the problem. In our case, we've got parity knowledge, or the parity principle and the practical principle. Those are the two principles. Remember, we're ignoring the disquotation one because it doesn't actually play a role in the derivation. So it would make sense then to replace the concept of knowledge, for certain purposes, with two concepts, one that has parity as its constitutive principle, but not the practical one, and the other that has the practical principle as constitutive, but not parity. Call them parity knowledge and practical knowledge. Those are going to be the replacements for the concept of knowledge. Each one could be fleshed out in various ways, but I'm not going to look at any of those ways. Instead, I want to lay out a different kind of semantic theory for knowledge locutions, and it's based here on page 4. The semantic theory says knowledge locutions are invariant, so it's a form of invariance. They have semantic values relative to points of evaluation that are at least world epistemic reading. Whoops, that should be pairs, not triples. That's a typo, my fault. World epistemic reading pairs. What's an epistemic reading? An epistemic reading is a way of interpreting the word knows in terms of one of the replacement concepts. So one epistemic reading of the word knows would be treating it as parity knows. The other would be treating it as practical knows. It determines a reading for the knowledge locution occurring in a sentence in question. Parity reading treats knows as parity knows. Practical reading treats it as practical knows. Now, the post-semantic theory says that X is true in a context U for utterance, from a context A for assessment, and it's true at U from A if and only if the content assigned to the clause representing P with respect to the index of U, that's the information from the context of utterance, is true at the point of evaluation, WR, where W is the world and R is the reading, where W is the world from the information from the context of utterance, the I sub U is for utterance, and R is the epistemic reading from the index associated with the context of assessment. A is the context of assessment. So the truth value of a sentence that contains the word knows is going to be a function of information from the context of utterance, especially the world that it's evaluated with respect to, and from the context of assessment, in particular, the reading of the word knows in the sentence in question. An argument, gamma phi, gamma is your set of premises, phi is your conclusion, is valid if and only if at every point of evaluation E for all lambda, or for all gamma in gamma. If all members of gamma are true at E, then phi is true at E. That might sound like a mouthful, but it is the standard definition of validity for a semantic relativist, and it gives you a classical logic for a fragment that includes knows. So there's no messing with the logic in response to the defect in our concept of knowledge. Instead, the logic is entirely classical. Note, it's an assessment sensitivity semantics, but it differs substantially from the one offered by Macfarlane. Macfarlane posits an epistemic standards parameter in the points of evaluation, not an epistemic reading parameter in the points of evaluation. There are lots of different epistemic standards. Right? Maybe there's infinitely many different epistemic standards. If that's the case, then that would mean that there are infinitely many different truth conditions for sentences that have knows in them. On my take, by contrast, there are two different epistemic readings, and that means there are two different sets of truth conditions for sentences that contain knows. Not an infinite number of different ones, or even a large number of them. Two. So you get a very different kind of semantic relativism. To sum up, knowledge is an inconsistent concept, but it shouldn't be eliminated. Instead, it should be replaced for certain purposes by a pair of concepts, parody knowledge and practical knowledge. Knowledge locutions are assessment sensitive, but not in the familiar way advocated by current epistemological relativists. And I think this fits really well with what Duncan Pritchard is calling a overriding anti-skeptical strategy. From the new book, we have the quote, an overriding anti-skeptical strategy will offer a revisionary diagnostic story, one on which we have an independent theoretical basis for disregarding the relevant intuition in play. On this way of dealing with the problem, the skeptical paradox is bona fide, in that there is indeed a deep tension in our epistemological concepts, pre-theoretically understood, which is being exposed by this puzzle. But it's also resolvable in that we recognize that there are independent theoretical grounds for revising our epistemological concepts in fundamental ways that avoid the puzzle. That is a particular style of dealing with skeptical paradoxes that Pritchard lays out very nicely as one option in his recent book, Epistemic Angst. And the proposal I've just given you is a particularly radical version of that strategy. So the thing that I've just given you is an overriding anti-skeptical strategy in the sense that it pins the blame on our epistemic concepts, and the solution to the skeptical paradox is revising our conceptual scheme by adding new concepts, new epistemic concepts to it that don't cause the problems that our concept of knowledge causes, despite the fact that they do together the work that we want our concept of knowledge to do. All right, that's it for me. Thanks.